Good morning to the families. I see new people here with babies and children, so it's nice to see the families here. And good morning to everyone up on the balcony. It's nice to see you up there and in video land as well. So, sacred service. Here we go. And thank you, Jennifer, for introducing that. We didn't even know that our themes were matching until our announcements came out about what we were doing. So Spirit's moving through as always. I'd like to start with the scripture of James 2:14 through 17. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and well fed," but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself is not, if not accompanied by action, is dead. The world is on fire. Have you noticed? Coronavirus, the depletion of soil, the polar bears floating on little pieces of ice, plastic in our waters, the Syrians who are refugees freezing right now. You know, we're just at a place, the fires in Australia that have finally gone out, but the land is now having to regenerate and the animals lost. We were just in California recently, and every person we visited talked about how close the fires in that land came to their homes. A mile here, a few feet there. It is so much to read the news, to be on Facebook. All of us know that. It's like, let's just turn it off. Let's ignore it. Let's not look at it. Let's be happy and joyous. Let's just go on with life. And yet we can't, because it's right here. It's right with us every moment of every day. How can we turn our backs on it? And yet at the same time, we often become stifled with it, frozen, like a frozen shoulder. You've heard of that, you know, where you can't move your joint anymore and it hurts and it's painful to move your shoulder when it gets frozen. Some of us have that. I have that. I don't have full range of motion. That's how it becomes with all the devastation that we hear about. And yet, our work is to be in the world, and this is a unity principle, to know that we're given this opportunity right here and right now to be with God, to be in God, to be love, to be joy, to be out there in the world as love, as joy. That is the practice, isn't it? And yet, I know for myself, I can become depressed or feeling the weight of the world on me, and at times stifled by it. So I just want to acknowledge that. This is an important piece in our sacred service, because what makes service sacred? I grew up in an activist family, and I learned about activism. That actually was my religion, because my parents were atheists. So activism was my religion. And it was only later in life that I came back into what I knew as a little girl about the divine nature of life. And then it became integrated into my activism. My prayerful, contemplative place that I take refuge in became the safe refuge, if you will, for my activism in the world. And so the important thing is to not get stuck, not to get frozen by everything that's out there in the news telling us on a daily level, moment to moment. Every time you get on Facebook, it's something new, or else it's glossing over that everything's hunky-dory, everything's rosy and Pollyannish, that everything's fine. We need to be aware of both. We need to be aware of the pain and suffering and at the same time live in a place of joy and love. And that's our work, that integration of both. That is sacred service. So I have 3 points I'd like to bring up of how to do this. The first is to keep your heart open. Keep your heart open at all times. Don't shy away from the pain and suffering. Don't close yourself down, but be mindful about how you take it in and when you take it in, just like the food we eat. Or on Lent, Will said, we've given up a few things in our dietary of what we're taking in. It's also important to be mindful of what we take in the news and the Facebook and know when to turn it off. And I will say, in our community, that is a gift because not everyone in the world, or many, many people in the world, live in such a way they can't turn it off, because their lives are such that they're living it, that pain and despair, that they can't turn it off. But we have that. And in turning it off, we can renew, we can recharge, we can re-energize ourselves to be able to be in that love, which is our service. The pain and suffering actually has motivated me in my work, strangely. But it's because it's integrated with the prayer. If all I did, and I was just with someone, we were with someone who works in domestic violence, and she's working with the people who are the counselors or the advocates in domestic violence cases, and she said they have compassion fatigue, And so we need to be mindful of our compassion fatigue that drags us down. There was a time a few years ago where it was Will's birthday, I think, and we decided, or no, it was my birthday actually, one of our birthdays. And I often like to take my birthday in a prayerful place and just turn everything off and just go into silence, be in prayer. And so I had done that. But there came something along that I had to turn my computer on. I had to check something out or something. So I got on my computer, and I happened to see an email announcement that came out, a news flash. And I was in a prayerful place. My heart was open. And I was in a place of feeling just open and vulnerable, I guess, in a way, in with God. And then I read this news flash, and it was about a 13-year-old girl in Somalia who had been raped by 3 men. And she went home and told her parents, and their parents turned around and told the militia. And 2 hours later, the militia came and took that 13-year-old girl, buried her to her neck, and she was stoned. Her name is Aisha Abraham Dukala. And whenever I think I can retire from my work or my ministry, I remember Aisha. That is what motivates me. But I can't stay in the pain of the world. I've got to lift myself out and I have to know that I am in service to God. I am integrated in that place of service, of love and joy, and I hold Aisha and I hold everyone who is in pain and suffering in my heart so that I can continue to serve. We all know these stories, and it's important, again, to acknowledge them, because if we don't acknowledge them, if we just shy away and push them under the rug and say, I'm going to go on with my life and not look at it, then we'll never transform. It's like telling the person to get over it, get over the domestic violence and forgive. We can't do that. We need to name it, acknowledge it, and move on with compassion, with love, with understanding. So the first one is keep your heart open and be mindful of what you're taking in, but keep your heart open. The second point is to find what matters to you most and give yourself fully in service to God and into the world. As you know, our work is here in our ministry. Our work is in the gender equity and reconciliation, and our work is in bringing religious traditions and people of all faiths together. That's my passion. What is your passion? What do you want to serve? What is your sacred service? And the sacred part is, what is that integration with the prayerfulness of what you bring into your daily life, in your contemplative life? And then how does that engage you in, and put the flame of love in your heart to work out in the world? A person that I have many mentors, as I'm sure many of you do, but one of them is Brother Lawrence, who many of you may know. He lived in the 1600s, and he worked in the monastery as the cook. And his whole practice was practicing the presence of God. So in everything he did, he would bring God to his heart. He did it for God's sake. My dad used to say, "Cynthia, for God's sake." That is a good thing. I remember that well. I was in trouble when it happened. But for God's sake, I pray and I do what I do. And that is the whole purpose, Brother Lawrence says, of our life, is to bring God into remembrance all the time, every time. And as we do whatever we do, however small or large, we do it in the service of God. And in doing so, that brings forth the sacred service out in the world. To get my papers together here. See where I am, sorry. The third point is to do your service with joy, love, and compassion. Everyone needs to smile a little more out there. Joy, love, and compassion in everything we do, whether it is changing dirty diapers, whether it's doing our tax forms, whether it is baking a cake. Do it with that joy, that love, and the compassion. It's very simple, but it's often difficult to do, because when we get angry, the ego comes in and we're all focused on myself, of what my issue is, my opinion, rather than thinking about how to give, how to let go of that anger and give and be in service to the greater good. Let God guide me. Let God be with me. Myrtle Fillmore was in continual service, wasn't she? She healed herself with God. God healed her, but she healed herself through the practice of prayer and affirmation. And then she didn't just stop there. She responded to letters and responded personally to these letters to help other people heal. That was her service in the world, right? That was her sacred service. So it wasn't this kind of this is my healing, this is my healing, this is all I do. She was out in the world. Actually, I just saw, I read in 1937, both Charles and Myrtle Fillmore, the founders of Unity, did 60 talks about the Lenten Easter season in Unity centers in Los Angeles, California area. That same year, they lectured in Northern California, including Oakland, San Francisco, and Alameda, and on Easter Sunday, they spoke in Portland, Oregon to a congregation of 1,300 people. They did not keep it just local. They went out in the world and spread the message. That was their sacred service. What is your sacred service? Myrtle Fillmore said, "It is not always best for a person to continue doing that which he likes to do or that which he has been trained. We need to round out, to develop all our faculties and powers to do that which brings us close to humanity and that which increases what the world needs most." So what does the world need most right now? What service do you need to bring forward? What are you doing? And how can you deepen that service? Whether it's here in Unity, outside Unity. The beauty of Unity is it brings us closer together when we do our service here together. It bonds us. This is also the fifth principle of Unity. It is not enough to understand spiritual teachings. We must live the truth we know. So we meditate, we pray, and then we bring it out into the world in our sacred service. So in just ending this little vignette, and then Will's going to speak a little bit, the integration, that's the key, the integration of our prayer and our life in service out in the world that's connected to the divine. We follow the examples of Jesus, of Buddha, of Mary, of Mother Teresa, of Myrtle and Charles Fillmore, to actually bring our life into the fullness of what sacred service is.
And as Cynthia was saying, we enter into the world of need with our hearts longing to serve God. And what happens in that process is that we are blessed as we give our blessing to others. That is the miracle of sacred service. Martin Luther King has a beautiful way that he put it. He said that we must never allow our pessimism about human nature to overcome us. But because if we don't balance our pessimism about human nature with our optimism about divine nature, then we overlook the cure of grace. This is really essential, that when we move into sacred service, the divine moves with us. The divine moves through us. In fact, the divine is the agency of sacred service. Not just in the Christian tradition. In the Bhagavad Gita, for example, in the 3rd chapter, one of my favorite verses, in every act of selfless service, the eternal Brahman is present. The Godhead is present in every act of selfless service. I think that is so beautiful, because that means even in the smallest gesture, when it comes from that yearning to serve another, when it comes from the heart, however small, the infinite Godhead is right there. And that means that when we enter into sacred service, we are actually uniting ourselves with God. And this is why we need to do this inner purification work, to clear it out, so that we can feel the truth of our hearts and then be guided by our hearts, and we will be naturally led into sacred service. Meister Eckhart put it so beautifully. He said the outer work can never be small if the inner work is great. The outer work can never be small if the inner work is great. And then he said, and the outer work can never be great if the inner work is small. So what he's really saying is that in order to do true spiritual service, we have to clear ourselves out. We have to do our own inner work. And as we do that, our service is strengthened. It becomes great. And this doesn't mean you have to, as Mother Teresa said, go out and do great things. As she put it, what we're asked to do is small things with great love. That's the key. It's the great love that we bring to it. And in that way, as Evelyn Underhill in her great book Mysticism writes, well, I'm paraphrasing here, so I'm not going to quote her, but she says that the greatest of humanity's servants have always been the ones who go to the mountaintop. They go to that place of spiritual refuge. They establish that connection with God. And then they come down from the mountaintop and come in to the marketplace, if you will, and serve. And then very often they go back to the mountaintop, and there's kind of a two-step. And that way, that path is available to any of us. Through our spiritual prayer and practice, we become opened. We become open to God's inspiration, divine presence, and then we move into the world. And that Spirit moves through us and into our fellow human beings and fellow non-human beings, and we become an instrument of God's peace, light, and love. So as just an example of this, a beautiful teaching about this, there was, during the Vietnam War, a peace activist who wrote to Thomas Merton, the famous Trappist monk, basically in despair, because he was really working for peace. The bombs were falling and continuing to fall. Many people were being killed, including many innocents. And he wrote in a kind of a desperation. And Thomas Merton wrote back, and he said this: "Do not depend on the hope of results. As you get used to this idea, you start more and more to concentrate not on the results of your work, but on the value, the rightness, and the truth of the work itself. And gradually you struggle less and less for an idea or a cause, and more for specific people. In the end, it is the reality of personal relationships that save everything." So we're beginning to work for specific people in specific contexts. And then he says the next step in the process is for you to see that your own thinking about what you're doing is crucially important. You are probably striving to build yourself an identity in your work, out of your work and your witness. That is not the right use of your work. So we are not doing service in order to build up an identity of I'm now serving. I am out serving the world. Because then that ego identification easily comes in and it begins to kind of corrupt the service, if you will. This is where prayer is so important, because when we stay in prayer, our own impurities are cleansed. They're revealed to us and then released and given back, and we become empty. We become an empty vessel inwardly. And then God's light and love can fill us, and we can move out in effective service with divine guidance. And this is what he says. So trying to build an identity out of your service is not the right use of your work. All the good that you will do will come not from you, but from the fact that you have allowed yourself in the obedience of faith to be used by God's love. Think of this more, and gradually you will be free from the need to prove yourself, and then you can be more open to the power that will work through you without your knowing it. This is what Jesus said when someone projected onto him how good he was. Why call me good? Only God is good. That goodness, that healing, that power does not belong to us, but it moves through us if we offer ourselves to it. And as Thomas Merton closed, he said, the real hope then is not in something we think we can do, but in God, who is making something good out of it in some way we cannot see. if we can do God's will, then we will be helping in the process. And this is really illustrated by a story that I want to share. Some years ago, when we were invited to Kenya, and we were invited by a very close colleague, Karambu Ringera, who we'd been working with for some years in South Africa, and Cynthia and Will, you're going to join me. Do you want to introduce Karambu? And then I'll start.
So I met Karambu. When I was in seminary and divinity school. Karambu Ringera, she's now doctor. And we were in a human transformation course taught by Dr. Vincent Harding, who was a close colleague, right-hand man with Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And during that course, my heart was open, and I just had tears coming down one of the first classes. And there were about 50 people in the course, and at the end, Karambu came up to me, and she said, "I see your tears, and my heart is open." And so we became close friends then, out of all those people. And Karambu is an amazing woman. She works in Meru, Kenya, which is where her home is. And she works with the children. She saw the need because the children were becoming orphaned because their parents had HIV and dying of AIDS. And then the children would go to their grandparents, but the grandparents then were dying also of age. And so these kids... AIDS and age.
Oh, I see. Okay. Sorry. I thought you meant AIDS.
But then the children were abandoned. So Karambu opened a home. And that home, since I've known her, has grown. And she's not just, she says, I'm not a healer. I provide a space for people to feel empowered to find who they are and what their life force is in the world. And so one of the things she's done is open a vocational school for the supposed dropouts in high school, mainly boys. And 80% of those children who graduate out of her training school have gone on to college. That's a high number, 80%. So she's doing amazing work.
So, thank you. So she invited us to come to Nairobi. And she gathered a group of her colleagues and networks, people in Kenya. We'd never been to Nairobi before. And we did this gender equity and reconciliation work. And it was a very interesting experience. A number of the people were also from her community in Meru. And of course, we're there, and they had a Kenyan male facilitator who was going to facilitate with me, which is really important. That's how we always work. We don't just waltz in as, some white folk from North America and presume to know. So we always establish this relationship, and we had this close relationship with Karambu and this male facilitator who she knew quite well. But then he got sick at the last minute, so he couldn't come. So there we are, and we said, well, okay, we'll have to make do, and so we get going. Well, then what happened was, when I started working with the men, these were all African men,
Black
African men.
Yeah.
And they all spoke English. They all understood English very well. But when I started trying to facilitate them, they just started speaking Swahili to one another. And they just blew me off. I mean, not sort of explicitly, but in effect, I was completely excluded because they were speaking Swahili with each other. I was trying to get them up and guide them in this exercise and ask them to do this and that, and they would respond in Swahili, of which I know zilch. So I was getting nowhere, and then we came back from the men's group and we came into another process, and the men again were not participating. They were basically boycotting the entire process. And what it turned out, and the women, as they witnessed this, the women knew why they were doing this. It was because of their initiation. Because in Kenya, the way the men are initiated when they come of age, they are actually, it's pretty excruciating. They go through a circumcision process as they reach puberty. And then after that, they're put into a cell or a private cave
hut,
or something,
hut.
a hut, for a month. And during that month they heal, and during that month the elders come in and give them teachings.
Elder
Men only.
And they're not allowed to speak with women. In fact, they need to stop sharing anything with women, their mothers, anyone.
Right. And
That's
so they're
part of the
basically
teaching.
instructed to now only share your deep truths with men and never with women. And, they cut them off from their mother and from really the women in their lives in terms of authentic communication. And so they were enacting this process by not participating in the exercise. So anyway, it was a pretty significant crisis. And at the end of the first day, we got with Karambu and we said, we do not need to impose our work. This is not our intention. We never come in and try to make people go through what we think is valuable. And so we were kind of ready to consider, kind of canceling and withdrawing rather than imposing. And she said, no. She said, let me talk to these men. And she did. And an hour later, we came up with a plan, and she had talked to the men. And the next day, they started participating. Do you remember what she said to them?
She just basically said that if we are going to have any change in our culture, in this intensely patriarchal culture, you are the men to lead this. You are the men that need to start making the change. And they worked with her. And she is a powerful leader in her community. During the time then as we moved through then, and they were participating, one of the young women, she was in her 20s, came forward and she shared very vulnerably about her life experience. Her father had died when she was a teenager, and her mother and her sister, maybe one or two sisters, were left alone. And her uncles came in and they took their land, they took their house, they took everything, they violated them in all ways. And it just devastated this young woman. And she had watched her mother in pain and suffering, but also her and her sisters. And she just shared her truth of that with tears running down her face. At that moment, one of the men stepped forward.
So one of the men said in that moment, witnessing her pain, she had never told this story with men present. They don't do that. They don't speak. They have no forum to speak these kinds of truths, and especially not in mixed company. So even doing that, she was breaking all the taboos. But there was one of the men in the circle, one of the Kenyan men, who was so heartbroken. And he said, my spirit moved me to where I knew that I needed to do something, that I somehow needed to apologize. And so this man stepped forward into the center of the circle and he knelt down in front of this woman. That alone was a huge thing. For a black African man, they would never, as Karambu put it later, men never give women space. It's just the culture. It's not their fault. It's how they've been trained. And to kneel down before a woman like that is just unheard of. And he knelt down and he said to her, I want to apologize to you on behalf of your uncles. I can't change what's happened to you, but I want you to know that I am deeply, deeply sorry for what you've had to go through at the hands of your uncles. And this young woman just melted. It was really amazing. It was one of those moments where you could feel this intense sacred presence in the room. And she just started streaming these tears of gratitude and of release. And she said later, when that man knelt down and apologized, she said, I was liberated. I just forgave my uncles. And I just felt totally cleansed. And she released this hatred that she had carried for all those years. So it was deeply moving. And we tell this story because it illustrates several of these principles. First, it demonstrates this kind of flow of blessings This whole process, if you do God's will, then you're part of something larger. When we took this, when Karambu created this event, she didn't know it was going to happen. When we came and accepted the invitation, we didn't know it was going to happen. And when this man came out and spoke his truth, he simply apologized to her. He didn't know that that was going to cause her to release and for her to forgive. And have what for her was a life-changing moment, a transformative moment in her life that she has never forgotten. Not only never forgotten, but after that,
this was 10 years ago, and since then she's married, she has a family, and she has her own publication, a journal, a magazine that brings women's voices out in Meru, Kenya, and highlights them and gives them a voice of empowerment. And the man, too, is involved in Meru in very healing ways, and the two of them are quite connected.
So she basically, out of that experience, created a forum for other women to have a similar liberating experience through telling their stories, through this journal that she has continued to publish since that time. So all of those little cascade of blessing after blessing after blessing all unfolded in ways that we could never have planned or orchestrated.
The second point is that while this one young woman was given a gift, because she had the safety to speak, but also this man apologizing, he was given a gift that he didn't even realize. The giver is given a gift and the gift is given to the giver, right? So it's back and forth, and that's what sacred service is. It's that reciprocal relationship. So as you're down in coffee hour later today and someone does something kind for you, then you are receiving, but you're also giving the opportunity back to them to give. And that's that reciprocal relationship, as well as the Cascadian effect that Will's speaking to.
So we have another reason for telling this story, which we're very enthused to share with you. And that is that 2 weeks from today, this wonderful, amazing African leader, Karambu Ringera, is going to be right here with us on this platform. Because she was coming out to Canada and to Toronto, and we said, well, because we've been working with her for a number of years, and we said, well, come to Vancouver. We actually invited her earlier and said, whenever you can come. And then it turns out she's coming in 2 weeks. And we're very, very enthused because she is so inspiring. And just to give you a little preview, her message is how to be in complete joy, even working in service of some of the most painful circumstances in life. There's a way in which we can bring joy to that and be joyful about life and not morose and upset by all of the difficulties and the travails of life. And believe me, as you know, in Africa there are plenty of them. But you will see for yourself, she is a living light of divine love and service, and very humble presence, and very inspiring teacher. So please join us for that 2 weeks from today.
So we just want to close with the reminder and a little prayer around the 3 points of how to be in sacred service that I opened with. Keep your heart open. Find what is meaningful to you to give yourself fully to in service of God and in service in the world. And third, to be joyful, to bring that service with love, with compassion, with joy in everything we do. That is the practice. That's what we're here to do, to stay aligned with the divine and be out in the world with our service. So I just want to uplift the service that we have here, the sacred service we have here with our volunteers that have already been highlighted. I also want to uplift the workers in the kitchen downstairs, primarily women. We're looking for some more men to join those women, but to get the balance, But the women downstairs that have been giving of their time, Tina in the nursery who gives of her time, there is so much happening right here in this community around sacred service. And what that does, and I said it, is as we give, we receive, and it bonds us even more closely together. So keep your hearts open as we go forward, and as the world is doing its thing, we connect here, and we know we'll ride this wave through all that's happening out there because we're in a place in the world of creating this new civilization. And it's hard work, but we're going to make it through. We're going to do it, and we're going to do it with joy, with love, with prayerful presence, and with compassionate hearts. That's what's required of us, right? Yeah. So, thank you.
Thank you.